Welcome back. Episode 14 of Ask Coach Nate. Today we're going to discuss how to align your fitness goals with your unique talents. We know that everybody has a unique set of talents inside of them. And Coach Nate is going to help us discover how to unlock and discover what aspects of your fitness are unique to you and how to take advantage of that in order to use those talents to win races, right? So Nate, let's talk about like the first step. How do people uncover, or how do they understand like what is unique about their fitness?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that most people that get pretty into training and racing and maybe have a power meter probably already have the idea of their power profile. So like their abilities at different durations as far as their peak power numbers are concerned. So Coggin and Allen have their famous power chart from their book from like the 90s. And there's more data out there now, so you can see kind of what percentile you're in, depending on like how much power you can do for like 10 seconds or 5 minutes or 20 minutes and so forth. And so you can get an idea just from like basic power numbers, or if you compare yourself to other people on segments on Strava of different durations. So like, you know, a 1 minute climb versus a 10-minute climb versus a 60-minute climb. And you can tell like, oh, I'm like much better at really short durations or intermediate durations and not as good at long durations or something like that. And you can kind of get an idea that you're maybe a little punchier, a little bit better at sprinting and anaerobic work, or you're terrible at that like I am, and you can go long distances at a high pace, and you can go over like intermediate to long climbs at a high pace and maybe drop people in those types of efforts. And so it's good to understand kind of like what your abilities are and what your limitations are. And then if you're racing, you kind of want to be able to map on like your abilities and liabilities onto the types of events that you want to be doing, so that you can, you know, increase your chances of success by like making sure your liabilities aren't going to completely prevent you from, you know, getting over the climbs in the front group, for example. But you also want to be able to push your advantage as much as possible and not just focus on, you know, shoring up your weaknesses to the detriment of like giving up your advantages.
Right. So compare what you see on different segments, understand your power numbers, and of course, like you need to do some racing to get a sense of where you fall in relative to other people racing, correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think racing is a little bit hard when you're newer to it because it's so dynamic and chaotic, and there's a lot of factors involved. So unless you're really really skillful at understanding the strategy and tactics involved with racing, sometimes you can get the wrong impression based on the way races play out, because sometimes somebody might like draw the wrong conclusion that they do well in a sprint, but maybe they're actually just a really good technical rider and they know how to position themselves well, and they're not actually a great sprinter. They're just kind of okay at it, for example, or things like that. Like you can kind of, you have your fitness mapped onto the event, but there's also the tactics involved. So it's a little challenging to tease out sometimes the differences, but you can get a feel for it for sure.
Yeah, I think in amateur racing, no one's a good sprinter.
Yeah, pretty much.
When you look at what the pros do too, like no one's a good sprinter. No one has any clue what they're doing. Anyway, yeah. So you've done some racing, you've done a lot of riding, or just riding, right? Maybe you don't want to race, but you want to figure out how to get the most out of what you do and where you ride and how you approach everything, right? So let's go through some scenarios. Like, what are the typical categories that people fall into, or how should they approach this?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I would imagine everything as being a spectrum between like being more fast twitch dominant and being more slow twitch dominant. Most people fall somewhere in the middle where they like have an okay sprint and they're okay at longer climbs, but they're not really like truly exceptional at either. But then there are some people that are really exceptional at long distance aerobic stuff, and they're just absolutely terrible at sprinting, and vice versa. And there's definitely those cases, but those are more the fringe cases. Most people are somewhere in the middle there. And you want to kind of understand like what you're good at, what's trainable for you, and then try to like put in training that's going to allow you to make progress. And you also want to take into account like what it is that you're training for, so that you're doing work that's going to help you be successful at whatever that is. And so even people that don't race, but they just want to go out and do like a 100-mile gravel ride, or they want to do like a fast group ride that is like, it does an hour-long loop in the hills near them. Like there's lots of different types of specific targets that people might have. And depending on what their abilities are, they might have different training that'll help them to be successful at that. I think a lot of people just kind of might pick up kind of what sounds like a well-rounded training program without thinking about whether or not they could make small adjustments to it to make it more specific to the event that they're training for, or more specific to their own abilities. And it might be their intrinsic abilities about like how much fast twitch versus slow twitch muscle fiber they have, but it might also just be their current training state at that moment in time. Because like how you train 6 or 12 months into your experience as a cyclist might be very different than how you train, 5 years or 8 years into your experience as a cyclist.
So how do you give some examples of how people perhaps optimize their training program, right? Yeah. I'll even use myself as an example, right? Like everyone always laughs when I say this. Like in the cycling world, I'm not a very skinny person.
Yeah.
And I'm last up the climbs of all the fast riders, right? So I know that about myself. So how could I optimize my training program, which I'm probably is not unlike a lot of other people out there?
Yeah, totally.
Take advantage of like what I am good at and what I'm not.
Yeah. So like a lot of people that are more like in your shoes, let's say, where like, granted, you might get dropped in some of like the Cat 3 or like 1, 2, 3 fields, for example, but also you're like fit enough that you've got like through the 5s and through the 4s, and like you're a solidly fit person. You're like, you can drop a lot of other people on
climbs. I'm just the slowest of the fast guys.
Yeah, exactly.
Still sucks.
Yeah. But so yeah, like that's a perfect example of like, you might not ever win a race against people that are like at your level by going up the last 10-minute climb the fastest. So like around here, like Pescadero is a perfect example of a race that like you're probably never going to win unless somehow the strategic, like the situation just worked out so that you were off the front solo or off with like 1 or 2 other riders and you were a better climber than them, and the field somehow just like stopped chasing, which happens. Like I've won races that way. You have to, be open to pursuing those opportunities when they come up. But just from like sheer fitness, like you're not going to win that race, right? But there are other races where maybe it's hilly, like Winters. It has a challenging climb, but it's on the far side of the course, and the last like 10 miles of the course is basically flat. So if you can get over that climb or those like series of climbs on the far side of the course in the front or second group, and it regroups and you're in the front group like going into the finish, which is like 10 miles after those climbs, then you could have a very good chance at doing well, right? So then it's a matter of like, are you fit enough to just not get totally destroyed on the climbs? And then you have like good tactics and good positioning and an okay sprint at the end of the race to like try to get on the podium or something like that, right? So you don't want to just like ignore climbing in your training and be like, oh, like I'm not a good climber, so I'm not going to train for it. You want to just think about like what races are important to me. And if climbing is not really important and sustained like 5, 10, 20-minute power is not important because you're only doing crits, for example, maybe you don't need to work on that. But if you want to be good at road racing and some of the road races that you care about where you want to get a result or you want to help your team get a good result, you want to be good enough that you're just not totally out of contention because you completely didn't train for climbing. But you don't want to just focus entirely on climbing and doing like 5, 10, 20-minute intervals only and maybe get better at that, but give up all of your like sprinting ability and all of your ability to like pace line hard on the flats, for example, which is a very different type of experience. So you want to shore up your weaknesses enough that they're not going to take you out of contention, but not focus on them too much that you're taking away from other aspects of your training.
Yeah, I feel like you're saying, optimize for your strengths, but don't neglect your weaknesses.
Yeah, you want your weaknesses to be sufficiently developed that they're not going to just completely wreck your chances of having a good event or a good result at an event. likewise for me, like I'm a terrible sprinter relative to other people, but it doesn't mean that I like don't work on my sprint because I need to be able to attack and counterattack and hopefully make a late race attack that I can like maybe break free of the field with like a half a K to go or something like that. And then sometimes like people are tired at the end of a race. And even if you're a terrible sprinter, if you just time it right and you have like an okay sprint, sometimes you could get on the podium, even though you would never have bet that way ahead of time.
Yeah.
I've had that happen.
So work on your strengths and try to focus on your strengths, and then of course like select the races that play your strengths, right? In some ways it's very straightforward. Specifically with training though, like how do you optimize for this, right? Like do you recommend that people like do less group rides, do more group rides, or like let's say you're not great at climbing, like how often would you work on your climbing then, right? Like what is the way to make it actionable?
Yeah. So I think for most people, if some aspect of their fitness is at all important, like even if it's your weakness, but you want to work on it enough that it is not going to prevent you from having the types of results that you want in the events or the group rides or the races that you're doing, I would work on it at least 2 or 3 times a month with like a pretty solid workout. Because if you do it just once or twice a month, you're definitely not, you'll be getting some gains, but you're not going to be getting nearly as much gains as if you just do that like twice as much and you do it like, let's say 3 or 4 times a month. So you could do it once a week or 3 weeks in a row and then take a week off working on your sprint, for example, if you're a terrible sprinter. And it doesn't necessarily mean that your entire workout needs to be focused on that one thing, but you want to have like a major stress on that system at least once or twice a month, or sorry, 3 or 4 times a month. And so that could be once or twice a week, depending on how you map it out on your training schedule. If you if you're working on something that's more like high-end fitness because you're a terrible sprinter, but you need some kind of a sprint capacity, like there's not that much energy and that much time that can be spent on that, because it's like if you do 10 sprints, that's already like an amazing sprint workout, and that's probably more than the optimal amount anyway. So in those cases, like you could probably tag that onto another workout, or you could just incorporate that into a hard group ride and just make sure that you're doing some very specific like high-end sprint work, for example. And you don't want to conflate like actual sprint work with just going hard kind of randomly in a group ride where you're doing anaerobic efforts, but they're like not really maximal. Likewise, if you're doing a hard group ride and you're pushing hard on some climbs, like just kind of randomly going hard over some rollers is very different than actually doing like 3 by 10 minutes of above threshold riding to really work on your high-end aerobic power. So just because something is hard doesn't mean it's like really absolutely stressing that system as much as it can. And sometimes if that is the option, like doing a hard group ride, sometimes skipping the group ride in favor of just doing a really focused workout, or recognizing that the group ride is not optimal for that and doing one of your solo rides as a focused workout is going to be the best way to make sure that you're really hitting that system well. And then sometimes, depending on the psychology of the athlete and what is going to be like motivating and fun and like get the most out of their training, sometimes I would think about like how it is that you can do that. So maybe like doing a solo workout could be more effective, but you hate it. Maybe you can find a training partner to do it with, or maybe you can go after some like Strava segments that like even if you're not physically with somebody else, like you're framing it as though you're racing other people because you're trying to get on like the top 10 of the leaderboard or something like that. And I think that sometimes there's like a kind of personality features that can make certain types of workouts better than others. But in general, group riding is never the best training unless you're really just focusing on like group dynamics and tactics. Like from a physical standpoint, group riding is almost never the best training.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think group rides are either they're not hard enough or too hard, or they're not hard in the areas where you need them to be, right?
Yeah.
So because it was very interesting about sprinting, like my personal opinion is that it's a very difficult thing to work on because you need to go, like you said, actually like much harder than I think most people think. And I think it's actually a very artificial type of thing to do.
Yeah,
Like
it
a
is.
15-second sprint. It's not really something that happens in a group ride. And if you think it's happening in a group ride, then you're not going hard enough.
Yeah, totally.
My kind of take on it, right?
Yeah. And it's like, if you think about it, it's never the optimal strategy. Like if you're doing a group ride, even if you're going for like a town line sprint, like the optimal strategy is to do like the least amount of work to get there first, which usually means like you're following wheels and then you try to like pit people at the line. But that's way different than doing like an all out 15, 20, 30-second sprint, which is better training, but it's not going to get you the right result when you're like on a group ride or in a race. The same with climbs. Like if you are like, unless you're on a group ride where you're doing laps on a circuit and there's like a 5 or 10 minute climb and people just go like full gas up it every time, that's not really the best aerobic workout that you could have, because you can do that workout solo or with like a training partner, but the group ride is going to do it like with variable pacing, and it's not going to be really maximal, you know?
That's so funny because yesterday I actually did this circuit for my training, and I was successful at getting someone to come who wanted to just do laps with me around this one thing. It's
Yeah.
very difficult to find a group ride where people want to just do a 30-minute lap around one set of streets over and over again. Yeah,
Yeah. Good
totally.
training partners are hard to find.
Who want to do something as mind numbing as that? Yeah, absolutely. Well, okay. So that all is good advice, I think, for people. My last question, I guess, in this area is like, what's trainable and what's not trainable, right? Like, there's a lot of discussion about certain, and the whole conversation today is about like finding what you're uniquely talented at and what you're really good at, right? So how do you uncover that, and how do you distinguish between the things that are like more trainable and the things that are, let's call it, like less trainable?
Yeah, I mean, in general, everyone is trainable and everyone can get better until they like really have exhausted their capacity and they're like at their physical limit. So, you know, whether that's like a world record performance for some people, or that's just like getting up Diablo in like under an hour or something like that, like everyone can make a lot of progress. And even when people are like 2 or 3 or 4 years in and they feel like they've reached some sort of plateau, like almost invariably, like I would bet money that they can get 5 or 10% better if they like change up their training, if they're more focused in their training or what have you. I think a lot of times the like the most actionable thing for some people is to make their training a little bit more focused. Like if they really care about getting fitness results, a lot of times like people that ride for fun and ride hard sometimes just aren't specific enough in their training, and they aren't going hard enough as we were describing when they are going hard. So they might do like hard group rides, or they might just go out and do like a loop that they like and they go hard on a certain climb that they like, but it's the same thing. It gets stale. It doesn't vary very much. And it is often not really like full gas training, which you don't want to be doing all the time, but you definitely do want to be doing sometimes. So most people are leaving stuff on the table because they're just not consolidating their intensity enough to like really make the gains. If people are doing focus training and it's like well structured, a lot of times like there's just a constraint with how far they can go with that because they're working and they only have so much time that they can, you know, train and sleep and do things like eating well and like getting, I don't know, like massaging their legs after they do training and stuff like that. So like most people, you know, they can't train more than 8 or 10 hours a week, so there's only so much they can do with that type of schedule. But in general, like every system that we have is trainable unless you've really been going at it for years and you're like exhausting your capacity with the schedule that you have. But the dose that it takes for different people to get the response that they want out of their training might be different. And I think that's something that comes up with like physiological studies. Like they'll have the same protocol for like 10 different people or 20 different people that are doing the same workouts over like a 3 or 4 month period. And you always see like some people don't show any change. Some people show like a 20% change in fitness, but it's like the people that didn't have their fitness change over the course of this like 8 week study, it doesn't mean that they can't get fitter. It's just that that particular protocol wasn't right for them, or it wasn't enough for them to like make fitness gains. And like maybe they went into the study already like active and somewhat fit. So like the training that they were doing as a part of the study wasn't more challenging than what they'd already been doing, but that doesn't mean that they can't get better. But in general, for individual athletes that are thinking about their training, I think a lot of times it's good to just be aware of like how your training has been in the past, where you seem to have the most, like the highest ability, whether that's like sprinting or intermediate duration stuff or longer duration stuff. And you probably have an idea of like, if you're doing well-rounded training that's challenging, what you enjoy the most and what you can't seem to get enough of in training. A lot of times that's an indication that those systems are, you have a lot more runway to like keep developing in those areas. So like, even though, for example, if we look at me as an athlete, like I'm not a great sprinter, I still work on it and I still want to have some high-end power, and that contributes to like my intermediate power. Like if I can sprint over 1,000 watts for 5 or 10 seconds, that might not come in very useful. It's not going to win me any sprints, but it does make me better at attacking, and it makes me better when I'm doing like anaerobic work that's like 1 to 3 or 4 minute intervals. But let me think how to try to formulate this idea. But like for me, even though I'm very strong aerobically, I can still tell that I have more room to develop in that area because I've been doing it for a while, and I can still see like responses in my body when I'm doing that kind of training. So early on, you want to have well-rounded training. And when you see certain systems plateauing, like no matter what you do, your sprint doesn't get any better, but you do keep getting better at those like 20-minute climbs, maintain your sprint and keep doing some work like that if that's important to you, but keep increasing the load on the systems that you see continued gains in, and you can tell that they aren't fully developed.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. The only thing I would like maybe even offer a slightly contrary view is like, I think after a while with training, like sometimes it's surprising what things you might go back and try that you end up being really good at. So that's the one thing I would offer up is like, I think anyone gravitates to things that come naturally, things that they enjoy, and usually things that they enjoy and they're good at are the things that are coming naturally, right? And so it's kind of this nice
self-reinforcing delusion,
right? Or self-reinforcing thing, right? But I don't think that's the be-all, end-all, and I just think that's important for people to keep in mind. The only reason I suggest this because I've had some personal experiences where there are things that I went back and tried for a variety of reasons. Sometimes I don't even remember why. I just gave it a shot one day, and I was actually really good at it, like much better than I thought I would be at it. So I think like, unless you're a professional athlete, if you're just an average person who is pursuing your fitness in your spare time as a hobby, I think it's really hard to understand exactly where the limits are. And sometimes when you progress in a certain area, you can go back and be really good. And so the concrete example for me was like, I actually got into cycling because I wasn't good at running, and I ran and I thought I was injuring myself, or I did get injured. So I switched to bicycling. And then for some reason, I got busy and I couldn't ride a bike. I started running again, and I was like all of a sudden really good at it. So, and that was something I never ever had imagined that I would have any talent in at all, right? So for me, I would just ask everyone to be optimistic, and like once you've made progress in one area, you might be surprised at progress you can make in another area.
Yeah, totally. And a lot of the time, like different systems do feed onto each other. So like if you've been doubling down on a certain type of training for a long period of time, like maybe that was fun. Maybe that's what you wanted to do for a long time and you did see continued gains in that area. But then if you go back to something else that you hadn't been focusing on for a while, you'll probably see gains in that area and maybe even like well beyond what you had previously done. So like in the long haul, you always want to like keep mixing it up and keep returning to things that you didn't focus on. And then even some things that are maybe like innate, like if you look at runners, a lot of times middle distance runners, as they age up, they will continue to go to longer and longer events. So if you look at like all the best marathoners in the world, almost invariably, they got their start with like the 5K or even the 1500, like 5 or 10 years earlier. And they just went from like the 1500 to the 5K to the 10K to the half marathon and then the marathon. So that by the time they're like in their 30s, they're doing these like really long events. And it's like to do a good marathon these days, you really have to have, really high speed. Like you have to be a 4-minute miler basically to be a good marathoner at the world-class level. But at the same time, there are athletes that they just focus on their event. And just because our bodies might have a natural tendency to develop a certain way, like you can keep training the systems that are important to you. So like you can have people that are milers even when they're in their late 30s and they're like way past what people would usually identify as their prime. So like Bernard Lagat is an example of that. Like he stuck with like the mile and the 5K for throughout his career basically, but other people that were the same age like ended up going longer and longer in their distances. But you can train and focus on the things that are important to you. But you're right. It's like we want to look for areas where we can develop and then never completely ignore any system, because sometimes we'll be leaving gains on the table.
Yeah, I think it's easy for people to just get stuck in their routine, right? Same
Yeah.
group ride, the same loops, the same
Ruts are terrible.
yeah, the same thing, right? And so that's why like sometimes it's really important to try something new and just see where you're at with that. I think that's why like there's a lot of stuff that you can do in the off season. I think that's always the best recommendation to try things. Well, I think that was excellent. And any final words?
No, I don't know. That's good. Just, I don't know, keep mixing it up in your training and look for opportunities to develop in whatever ways are meaningful to you, and don't get stuck in a rut.
Exactly. Don't get stuck in a rut, but do try to focus on your unique talents and make the most of like what you have. All right. Hey, if you like this content, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and we'll be back next week. Take
Thanks.
care.
Bye.